If you have your Bibles, turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day, and Paul is talking about the day of Jesus coming, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. We talked about this last Sabbath. Paul is saying, as much as we want to think Jesus is coming soon, we'd like to say that he could come anytime. Paul says that's not true. Paul says before Jesus comes, something has to happen. There's going to be something called the great falling away. Another way of saying it is there's going to be a great apostasy from the faith. Something's going to happen to challenge Christianity, challenge God's gospel, God's truth. Paul is saying that this man of sin would be revealed in the future of his day, and that apparently the man of sin is going to be revealed by his involvement in the apostasy or the falling away. Now, last Sabbath we learned that the man of sin is primarily Satan. He is the instigator of all sin. So he is the primary man of sin. However, Satan always works through a human surrogate. He finds some human instrumentality, some power, human power, that he can use to work through to accomplish his purpose. So we can say then that this term, man of sin, or man of lawlessness, he calls it in another verse, refers to two, as a double application. First, to Satan himself, and second, to the human surrogate that Satan uses. Now, our first task is to try to figure out which of Satan's surrogates is he talking about here in 2 Thessalonians. For Satan has been working through human instrumentalities for a long, long time. He has been using human instrumentalities to accomplish his evil purposes for centuries. So which one of those human surrogates is Paul talking about here? Last Sabbath we also came to the conclusion that Paul, when he talks about the coming of the man of sin, is probably not talking about some entity that we haven't already heard about. He's probably talking about a surrogate of Satan that we already know about. Otherwise, he would have given us more information. So, as we look at the Old Testament and survey the whole Old Testament, there is only two prophecies in the whole Old Testament that talk about a man of sin, or a person who is going to promote sin in a powerful way that is future to Paul's day. Now, there was lots of them in the past, but only two prophecies in the whole Old Testament that point to a future in Paul's day, a future man of sin. And those two prophecies are found in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Both of them referring to actually the same person. Two prophecies referring to the same surrogate. And that surrogate in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 is identified as in the Bible as the little horn. So the little horn of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 appear to be the man of sin that Paul is talking about in 2 Thessalonians. This little horn of Daniel 7 and 8 is described as doing the very things that Paul says the little horn, as Paul says, the man of sin or the man of lawlessness is going to do in 2 Thessalonians. They're describing the same experience. Let's look at how Paul describes the work of this little horn. My words aren't coming out right. How Paul describes the man of sin or the man of lawlessness. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4. Paul says this man of sin is going to oppose and exalt himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Well, that's a pretty good description. There's certainly not going to be many surrogates who are going to fit that description. Well, let's go on in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 9 and 10. The coming of the lawless one, that's the man of sin, same person, is according to the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish. And then Paul says one more thing about this man of lawlessness. 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 8. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. So there is Paul's description of this man of sin or man of lawlessness. Now listen, as we go back to Daniel, and notice how Daniel describes the little horn and his work that's going to be future of Paul's day. Daniel 7, verse 25. And he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. That's why he's lawless. He's changing God's law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. Now we'll talk about this times and half a time later in another sermon. Daniel 8 now, Daniel 8, 10 and 11. And it grew, still talking about this little horn, it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his, Jesus, God's sanctuary, was cast down. So you see, it's describing the same work. Daniel is describing the little horn doing the same things that Paul says the lawless one or the man of sin is going to do. So Paul is obviously simply describing this prophecy of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 as he talks about the man of sin that's got to come before Jesus does. Paul clearly understood that this was all future of his time. It wasn't going to happen even probably very soon the way Paul talked. Daniel records that an angel told him something special about this man of sin, this man of lawlessness, or this little horn. He says an angel came to him and told him this. Daniel 7, verses 23 and 24. So here is an angel now giving us some identification of this little horn or Paul's man of sin. The fourth beast, the angel says, shall be a fourth kingdom on earth. Now Daniel had seen four beasts. And the angel says, this fourth beast, shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it in pieces. The 10 horns, this beast, this fourth beast, was going to have 10 horns. And the angel said, these 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. In other words, this fourth empire of Daniel's vision had 10 horns, and those 10 horns represented that this fourth kingdom was not going to be succeeded by another kingdom, but it was going to be divided into 10 kingdoms. Okay? Then he goes on to say, another, it doesn't say horn, but another shall arise after them. This fourth beast divides into 10 kingdoms, then the angel said there's going to be another power coming out of the 10. And another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. So the angel is saying there's going to be 4 world empires. The fourth empire will be exceedingly great and strong, but there won't be a fifth one. The fourth one is going to crumble into 10 kingdoms, 10 divisions, and then out of those 10 divisions, another power is going to arise, and it's this little horn power that's going to speak like the man of sin. He's going to change God's times and laws. He's going to attack even the sanctuary of God. He cast the host down to the ground. Wow, he's an ambitious little fellow. Well, this helps us to understand why Paul can talk like he does in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 5 to 8. Look at this. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 5, 6, 7, and 8. And Paul says, do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And apparently Paul had been explaining the prophecies of Daniel to the Thessalonians. And now you know what is restraining, that he might be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way, and then the lawless one will be revealed. Well, what Paul is simply saying is that the little horn can't come until this fourth empire crumbles and divides. The little horn can't appear until the 10 divisions of this fourth world empire appear. So the little horn is being restrained. He's being held back, and he can't reveal himself. He can't come into existence until the fourth empire ceases to exist, which was something like 400 years in future of Paul's day. The Roman Empire lasted until 476 A.D. Paul lived in 50 A.D. So it was hundreds of years in the future in Paul's day. And Paul is saying, the little horn's going to come. I mean, the man of sin is going to come. The man of lawlessness will be revealed. But right now, he's being held back. He's being held back by the existence of the Roman Empire. He's being held back until the Roman Empire disintegrates. So who is the restrainer? The Roman Empire in Paul's day. That was what's keeping the little horn from appearing. The little horn couldn't come until Rome falls. And so it's the Roman Empire that is the restrainer that's holding back the little horn. And he held back that little horn for 400 years, 425 years at least, from Paul's day. And notice it says, in verse 7, he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Then the lawless one will be revealed. So Paul is telling the people of his day, Jesus is going to come, but not before certain things happen. And this main thing that's going to happen can't happen until Rome falls. And let me tell you what, in Paul's day, it didn't look like Rome would ever fall. Rome was powerful in Paul's day. And Paul was saying that Jesus is going to come, but it's a ways off. Now, I don't suppose Paul had any idea how long Rome would exist as an empire. But based on past experience, it would probably be at least 100 years, because most of those empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, they lasted for a considerable amount of time. So Paul was, based on historical experience, expected the Roman Empire to last at least 100 or so years. So it was way off in distance as far as Paul's time was concerned. Apparently, Paul understood the book of Daniel pretty well. It's even possible that Jesus helped Paul understand the book of Daniel, because Daniel chapter 9 is a fantastic prophecy of the coming of Jesus. It even tells us when he's going to come. It tells us when he's going to be crucified. So obviously Jesus told and educated Paul about the book of Daniel, especially Daniel 9. So Paul had been talked to by Jesus about the prophecies of Daniel. But apparently, Jesus, like the angel talking to Daniel, chose not to reveal how long in the future it's going to be, how long you're going to have to wait. Jesus has always wanted us to anticipate the coming of Jesus and not put it off too far in the distance. But this prophecy was putting the coming of Jesus off a long time. Okay, now Paul is a smart man. He knows that if you put something in writing, it can come back to haunt you. And I hope we all know that. You be careful what you put in writing. It could fall into wrong hands, and it could be misunderstood, and it could get you in trouble. I learned a long time ago not to put anything in writing if I can avoid it, and especially if it's inflammatory. And this would be inflammatory to the Romans. I mean, they wouldn't take kindly to someone running around preaching that Rome was going to fall. And Paul knew better than to use the word Rome or Roman Empire, because he didn't want this letter falling into the wrong hands and creating an unnecessary problem. This is why Paul used the word restrainer instead of Rome. And he told the Thessalonians, you know what I'm talking about, because I explained this prophecy to you when I was there. And you know this restrainer is going to be taken out of the way one of these days. And when he's taken out of the way, then the little horn will appear, the man of sin will appear. Now, today, we live in a different situation than Paul did. Paul couldn't see into the future. Certainly he couldn't see 400 years into the future, 500 years, 600 years, 1,000 years. He couldn't see that. He had the prophecies said the man of sin or the little horn was going to change God's times and laws and speak great words against God. He knew that. But he couldn't see everything that we can see. But today, it's all happened. Rome has fallen. Rome has been divided into the modern nations of Europe. And out of these modern nations of Europe, there has arisen another power that has accomplished almost to perfection everything the prophecy of Daniel and the prophecy of Paul said he would do. We can look back and see it today. I've got a slide to show you. In fact, I got 3 slides. Gentlemen, let's have slide number 1. I think they're paying no attention to me. Slide number 1 come up, next slide, please. There's the one I want. This is from a little bit of history books, historical books. This first one is, but when the Roman Empire had disintegrated, and its place had been taken by a number of rude, barbarous kingdoms. That's the 10 divisions of Europe. Next slide. The Roman Catholic Church not only became independent of the states in religious affairs, but dominated secular affairs as well. Next slide. Out of the ruins of the Roman Empire, there gradually rose a new order of states whose central point was the Papal See. It's mind-boggling, but apparently the little horn, the man of sin, the man of lawlessness, was the church itself, or it was the leadership of the church itself. It was the power structure within the church itself. For centuries, the Roman Church controlled the consciences of people. Now, many church members resented that change. It didn't go easy. A lot of church members said no to those changes. It was just unthinkable to many Christians that the leadership of the church would decide to change God's laws, change the teachings of Jesus. But that's what happened. Listen to this quotation. It's a Roman Catholic quotation from a Roman Catholic book. The Pope has power to change times, to abrogate laws, and to dispense with all things, even the precepts of Christ. This was what was being taught centuries ago by the leadership of the Christian church. This happened a long time ago, way back years and years ago. Starting back in 538 AD up until 1798 AD. That's a long time, 1,260 years. This was happening. This was the thinking of the leadership of the Christian church. Now, as I mentioned, that this was terribly offensive to many members of the church. Let's be honest. This was the leadership. This wasn't the normal church member. Many of the church members resented it and opposed it. But that really wasn't a good idea. Listen to this quotation. Next one, please. This is the Converse Catechism of Catholic Doctrine by Peter Gehrman. The question, why do we observe Sunday instead of Sabbath? Because the Catholic Church transferred the solemnity from Saturday to Sunday. as I said, a lot of church members didn't like these changes and resisted these changes. The leadership of the church, though, were determined, absolutely determined, because, let's face it, they were being controlled by Satan himself, the original man of sin. They had allowed themselves become so deceived with their self-importance that they had become controlled by Satan rather than Jesus. The leadership of the church didn't take kindly to opposition. Oh, they tried persuasion, and they had all kinds of lying wonders. I mean, they told all kinds of great stories. But finally, the church had to resort to force. And we read it in the next slide. This is from the book Western Watchman, Roman Catholic Work. The church has persecuted. Only a tyro or novice in church history will deny that. And so the leadership of the Christian church tried to force church members into complying, into giving up their faith and buying into these changes that they had introduced. There is a man living right here in Raleigh by the name of David A. Plasted, P-L-A-I-S-T-E-D. He's a computer science professor at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, I'll get it right. He's a professor of computer science at the University of North Carolina. But he's a man who's got a keen mind and is interested in all the topics. He, by the way, has a website defending creationism against evolution. Good to read. If you want to look up some good stuff on creationism, check out David Plasted. But anyway, in 2006, he decided to do a research to see if he could prove the oft-quoted number of 50 million people being killed by the Roman Catholic Church during the Dark Ages. He wanted to see if he could prove it. He wanted to verify it. So he did a research paper. Here's the name of the research paper in case you want to look it up. It's on Google. Estimates of the number killed by the papacy in the Middle Ages and later by David A. Plasted. It's available to you if you want to read it. Well, here's his conclusion. He says there is good evidence that as many as 45 million people died during the 300 years of the Protestant Reformation. 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. He said there's good evidence. He can find good evidence that 45 million people killed during the Protestant Reformation. Now he said going back before the Protestant Reformation, it's more difficult to verify what was going on. I mean, that's going back from 1400s, 1300s, 1200s, 1100s, all the way back to 538. But anyway, he says that there is possibility that there were as many as 20 million people who were killed prior to the Protestant Reformation. Plasted says that his research indicates that the total number of people killed by the papacy in enforcing their changes upon the church, killing those who didn't want to accept those changes, so that as many as between 50 and 68 million people were killed. That's horrible, awful, awful. That was something that was future of Paul's day. He said there's going to be a falling away. There's going to be an apostasy. It's going to be tough. And it turned out to be just that. As our scripture reading this morning said, Jesus warned that there's going to come a time of trouble, that unless I cut it short, all faith will be destroyed. Well, in 1798, it was cut short by Napoleon Bonaparte. But now, the prophecy doesn't end there. I wish it did. I wish it ended there. I wish I could say it's all in the past. Now, Paul couldn't see what we can see. Paul had the prophecy of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. That's what he had. But we got something much more than that. 40 years after Paul lived, God gave John the visions of the book of Revelation. And Revelation has a prophecy that picks up the work of this little horn, this work of the man of sin, and shows us today that there's still a future work. The Apostle Paul and Daniel both recognized that this little horn power, this man of sin, was going to exist and continue his work until Jesus comes. Look at Daniel 7, verse 11. We'll take Daniel first. Daniel 7, verse 11. There we are. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. That seems to be a reference to the coming of Jesus. Hellfire. He's going to exist until Jesus comes. And Paul says it more explicitly in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 8. Paul says this man of sin. Okay. 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 8. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. So this man of sin isn't done. Not by a long shot. He's not done. He is still determined to claim the worship of the world. He's still determined to be like God, to take God's place. And so the work of that little horn, the work of the man of sin, the work of the man of lawlessness is still going forward. Sort of in a lull right now. The book of Revelation describes that. And then the book of Revelation tells us that his work is going to be revived. And we're going to study about that in a couple of weeks. Next Sabbath, Thanksgiving Sabbath, Robert is going to be preaching next Sabbath. I'll take a Sabbath off. Then the week after Thanksgiving, we'll come back to this prophecy of Paul's in Thessalonians to see how the man of sin, the man of lawlessness is not through. He's going to do his best to complete what he started during the Dark Ages. Hope you'll be with us in a couple of weeks when we complete the work of the study of the man of sin. In the meantime, the question comes, how willing are we today to accept changes? Especially changes of God's time and God's laws. Ask yourself, honestly, if you were confronted with a change in God's law, would you go along with the church leadership and accept it? Or would you be willing to risk your life, if necessary, to oppose it? If you'd lived during the Dark Ages, or if you'd lived during the Protestant Reformation, would you be one of those who had lived, or would you be one of those who had died? How precious to you is God's Word, God's truth.